Hey class, today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the federal budget and what the government does when the budget is out of whack. First off, I think we need to just remind ourselves that the government needs money for numerous things. Currently, the federal budget is about $3.7 trillion, and that funds anything from entitlement to the military to health codes to even delivering the mail. And how do they come up with that number? Well, first, experts might create a number based on what they know is going to cost to do a certain job. For example, let's say the Air Force wants to purchase 3 additional fighter jets at $135 million a plane. The company who builds it, in this case, let's say Lockheed Martin, builds the plane, tells the government the price, and the government knows that they're going to have to shell out maybe $405 million to pay for those 3 planes. And this type of scenario happens across all types of different scenarios. So after the government tallies up all its costs, they make a budget. And then they might include what they want to spend money on, or what's going to get more money and what's going to get less money. And this happens through the debate really between Congress. Remember, Congress has the power of the purse, and the president, who has to sign off on the budget since he's going to be the one and as the administrator of the laws Congress makes. However, a budget doesn't just total up what government is going to spend on. It also totals up how much money the government actually has. And if there's not enough money to fund the programs that the government wants to fund, then they may have to cut programs, or they may have to cut funding. There's a couple things that happen with a budget that could happen. First off, if there's less money coming in than what's needed, we have something called a deficit, and then we end up deficit spending, where we spend more money than what we have. You could also have a balanced budget, where the amount of money coming in matches how much the government is going to spend. And then you could also have a surplus, where the government takes in more money than what it needs. If the government, when it comes down to deficit spending, because that's typically, sadly, the type of budget we have to deal with the most, wants to still fund programs, or wants to create some options, they really have 3 options when it comes to deficit spending in order to make sure we have a healthy economic budget. First is you could cut programs. The second is you could raise taxes. And the third is that you could borrow the money. And we're going to talk about the associated dangers with each 3 of these, and show how each of these creates problems in the economy and actually hurts everyday Americans. That's why it's so important. Usually, when the government raises taxes, it does so because it needs revenue or more money. And there are numerous times the government does raise taxes. During most of our history, for example, taxes have been raised during war because wars are costly. You have to pay for soldiers, for their food and care, their equipment, their transportation. However, the government may also need to raise taxes to provide appropriate funding. Let's say you would like government to provide housing for the homeless. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, it's going to cost something, though. And money is going to need to be spent on construction of houses, which includes labor, supplies, time, and leadership, all along with the need to actually maintain the houses. So that money comes from either 2 places. Like I said, you could raise taxes or you could borrow the debt. Today, on this part, we're just going to focus on what happens when you raise taxes. If the government decides to raise taxes, it's naturally going to face a public backlash, because taxes, that we discovered, are tricky in America. But for the sake of the example, let's just say the public is okay with with raising the taxes, so the program gets the money they need. In our case, yay for housing. However, by raising taxes, the government has also taken money from the public that they would spend or save in other areas. And when people have less money in their pockets, and this isn't just true of taxes, but typically when people have less money in their pockets, they can't go out and buy as many luxury items like dinners at restaurants, flowers, vacations, cars. And when businesses don't have as much money, they can't afford to keep people on staff, which means people lose their jobs and a recession occurs. A recession is just a period of decreased spending. And the last one we experienced really lasted, and we're still lingering from the effects of it, lasted really from, I would say, 2012 back to 2007. And what happens in a recession is people end up losing jobs because they might have lost money elsewhere, and they're not spending as much, and then that creates a ripple effect where businesses are no longer getting the revenue that they need, so therefore they have to lay off people, and it becomes a vicious cycle because unemployment does not necessarily breed spending. And let me be clear, a recession does not have to be caused by high taxes alone, but high taxes at times have contributed to a recession, specifically in the 70s and 80s. And during the second era of the Great Depression, when the payroll taxes went into play for Social Security specifically. So when people lose their jobs because taxes are high, that means the government also loses funding, so they're no longer then funding programs that they need since they can't get it from people's income, and the government is soon blamed for the public's problem. Their decision has become their doom. Not only have they raised taxes, but eventually they may have to cut programs simply because they can't raise taxes on people that can't afford them anymore, and there's no income coming in. So this is why people should always question whether a public service should be instituted, because all programs need money, and that money has to come from somewhere. Okay, so let's say the government just wants to feed the homeless still and provide housing. Again, nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't want to raise taxes, do so because of the danger that comes with raising taxes. So they borrow the money. And the government borrows money in a lot of different ways. Does so through other countries, but it also does through something called treasury bonds. Treasury bonds are something government issues that are kind of like an IOU. You buy the bond as an investment, and the government promises to pay you back with interest. Interest on the treasury bond is typically very low, but it's typically a very safe investment where you're typically guaranteed to get your money. This is where most countries buy bonds from. And just to clarify, you may have heard that China owns the United States' most amount of debt. That's not true. China does have a small percentage of our debt, but Japan is actually right behind it as well. Most of our debt actually comes from, in some ways, is to ourselves, which is a little weird. But I'm going to post a video below that will explain that. But we have roughly about $17 trillion in debt. China only has 1.7 of that. And it doesn't mean that they therefore control our economy. They have bought our money simply as an investment because the country is seen as a safe investment. I digress. So that's how the government usually funds money, is through Treasury. You buy a bond and then they pay you back with interest. And what the government gets in return is that they get the benefits of funding the budget without tax cuts, and then hope for a better economic timing in the future when the economy is booming and tax income's coming in a little bit heavy at a little bit faster rate, and then they therefore pay that interest back. This certainly happened to some degree during the Great Depression and after World War II. But here's the eventual problem. The interest contributes to the national debt. And as we borrow more and more money, our national debt goes up, and that interest has to be serviced. It has to be paid, which means that more and more of the budget has to go to servicing debt. And you can see this graph chart I have on the left, what happens when interest is added to the budget. So what happens eventually is that we have to pay off the debt, we have to service the interest, and it more or less means that the government then needs to raise taxes to pay for that interest, and then they're spending less money on government programs. So we end up paying more taxes for less programs. And Greece is a great example of this, where they had many government programs. A lot of it was paid for with debt, and they didn't have necessarily a very robust economy. So when the time came to pay that debt, they couldn't, which means they had to raise taxes and cut programs, increase decrease entitlement programs, and currently Greece has I believe they're about 25% unemployment rate. And cities in the United States have also faced this. Atlantic City is about to, and Detroit have faced a similar type situation where they can't pay their debts, and they still have to operate as a government, but they're getting to the point where they might not even be able to operate basic services, let alone services that might help the homeless. So, borrowing money isn't always the best thing either. It can be a short term solution, but it will have its consequences eventually. All right, well, what about lowering taxes? Lowering taxes is usually done at numerous times. It might be done when there's an economic boom and the government raises more revenue that they need, so they decide that they give that money back to the people since they don't need it. They might as well give people the chance to invest wherever they want. The other option that they may have if they encounter a budget where they can't pay for everything is they might decide to cut a program. Well, cutting something seems easy, right? Numerous Americans make cuts in their budget every month, and they manage. However, budget cuts are not something everyone is always in favor of. Government programs usually employ people, which means people are going to lose their jobs when a cut is put in place. Typically, and when we look at services as well, the poor and elderly would also be the first to suffer because many government programs are aimed at helping individuals who are having a really hard time. Even with defense, when the military decides that they don't need a certain project, they might cost up to 95,000 people a job, and that certainly happened when the F-22 fighter jet was canceled. And as a result, you have up to 100,000 people that are out of a job, and that means that again that could lead to a recession. So cuts aren't always great either. It's important to remember that budget cuts always have an impact on someone, and therefore the government has to be careful. If you want to give lower taxes and get more money in people's hands, you're going to have to cut someone's job. That's typically what it comes down to. Again, sometimes the government will borrow that money and lower taxes because they're hoping that lower taxes will actually improve the economy and allow it to have an upturn. This is actually something that George W. Bush did and administration did, and in some ways it did work. They cut taxes and borrowed the money for the war, and the economy boomed for a certain period of time, but then we're left with a big trillion-dollar deficit, which contributed to the debt, which may hurt us in the future, and most likely we will probably have to address at some point. So lowering taxes is not necessarily always the best solution as well. Typically, when it comes to managing the budget, it's not that easy, and no one decision is as easy or as simple as someone's household.